Today we have two great speakers. As usual, we have Vimal Mishra, who'll be talking about heat and drought during the Indian summer monsoon, and Daniela Domeisen from ETH talking about dynamics and predictability of extreme events, sort of more generally. And the announcement slide this time is very thin because there's not really any announcements at all. Just for the purposes of completeness, I put this on here. We're not going to have the social hour social half hour this time, but we will have it following the next webinar, maybe 6 weeks from now, and possibly every webinar thereafter. We just didn't plan it this time. So if you enjoyed that, look forward to it in about 6 weeks. So that is all for me. And in my presentation there. And now I guess I'll turn it over to Kai to do a quick introduction of Vimal, and we'll get started.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. And while I'm doing the introduction, Vimal, feel free to already start screen sharing. So yeah, our first speaker will be Dr. Vimal Mishra. He's an associate professor and group leader of the Water and Climate Lab at the Indian Institute of Technology in Gandhinagar. And next to surface water hydrology and large-scale hydrologic modeling, his research interests include climate variability and change as global food and water security. And yeah, today he will tell us about hot and dry extremes during summer monsoon in India. And yeah, we're really happy to have him. Please go ahead.
All right, so thank you very much, Colin and Kai, for this nice opportunity for today's webinar. And can you hear me, everybody, if I may ask?
Yeah, you sound good, Vimal.
Great, thanks. So I'll be talking about hot and dry extreme during summer monsoon in India. And this is basically work that was published earlier this year in NPJ, Climate and Atmospheric Sciences. So in this, basically, as this webinar theme is compound extremes, so I mean, we looked at how the hot and dry extremes, especially in summer monsoon, will turn out in the future climate and what implications those might have in terms of food production or crop yields in India. And this work was, I would also like to sort of acknowledge other co-authors. So Deepti Singh from Washington State University and Kaustubh Thirumalai from University of Arizona, along with my student Saran Adhar, they all contributed to this work. All right. So, I mean, if you come to India right now, you will see a lot of scenes like this where farmers are working on sowing the crop. So you can see in the screen, this is rice being transplanted, and monsoon is the key. So monsoon onset and monsoon rainfall during the entire season. If you don't know about the Indian summer monsoon, monsoon starts in June and it ends in September, right? And between June to September, there is a lot of intra-seasonal variability. So you will have active phase of monsoon, and you may also have long breaks. And if the breaks are longer, and many during this 4-month time period, we may end up seeing drought. And then these kind of pictures you may not witness because rice needs a lot of water to transplant, and that will come mostly from groundwater. So monsoon failure and droughts during the monsoon has not only implications in terms of food security, they also have implications in terms of groundwater abstraction, which is rapidly declining in India. So this is monsoon 2020. I mean, it has been raining. The onset was normal, and it caused flooding. So this is nice picture came from NASA a few weeks back, I think 2 weeks back, and all red areas you see in this image, basically those are the regions that received a lot of rain. And so this year monsoon is better than normal, and a lot of areas have witnessed massive flooding, especially Bihar, wherever you see these red colors, except the Western Ghat, which is this region. And it has been raining since last 4 or 5 days in Gujarat also. So I am from here, if you can see my cursor. And so the, the monsoon has roughly 10% or so variability from its long-term mean. So whenever the departure is more than 10% from the mean, you can say that monsoon was abnormal in terms of drought or wet extremes. And so you will witness a lot of, if you look at a lot of long-term data from India Meteorology Department, and in this you see like the years in the top panel, basically the drought extent, so how much area of the country was affected by droughts during the monsoon season. And these tall bars will basically, these are the major droughts occurred between 1951 to 2018. So during the droughts, you will see normally these kind of pictures, water availability goes down, crop basically are suffered with the lack of water, or if the monsoon is delayed, then sowing of the crop is also affected. One interesting thing you can note in these two major droughts, which I'm highlighting here in terms of SPEI, which is a standardized precipitation evaporation index, and that tells us how what was how severe the drought was, and that is the temperature anomaly on the right hand side. And you see that whenever monsoon drought happens, there is also temperature anomaly associated with it, because normally the long summer before the monsoon is basically affected or cooled down with the monsoon, and when the monsoon is weak, there is a temperature anomaly, positive temperature anomaly, as you can see for 1965 and 2002 droughts. So, so this brings us with the idea like how this kind of extreme dry and extreme hot conditions may occur in the future, and how that was basically the idea about this entire work which we did. I mean, you all know that monsoon is the lifeline. It affects GDP, employment, various other things in India. So once drought happens, everything sort of gets affected, not only food products and water availability, but also in employment, GDP. And so we wanted, we were interested to sort of understand that how these kind of hot and dry events, summer monsoon extremes, may change in the future. And so basically we used data set observations from India Meteorology Department from 1951 to 2018, precipitation and temperature. We also looked at what is the impact of hot and dry extremes on food grain production, and also some crops like rice, wheat, and yields, wheat and cereals yields. And we also use other data set to sort of understand that what is the long-term or what is the climate variability connection with the ENSO and things like that. So we used observed sea surface temperature from Hadley Center. For future projection, we use 40 large ensemble data set from the CESM Community Earth System model that is available from 1920 to 2100. The good thing with this data is that it enables us to analyze extreme events, which normally we cannot get if you have just 100-year projections from a single climate model coming. Right? So we use surface temperature and precipitation from the lens, CSM lens, to look at the future conditions. And then how we estimated hot and dry monsoon extremes. So we used a standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, and that is an index basically that tells us what is the basically how severe is a drought in any given period. So we used PET, which is potential evapotranspiration, estimated using modified Penman-Montieth. And modified Penman-Montieth considered the CO2 effect long term because that is increasing. So that is basically considered if you compare it with the normal Penman-Montieth condition. Now, a standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index is slightly different than normally we use a standardized precipitation index, that is SPI, that is solely based on precipitation and doesn't consider the role of evapotranspiration. So in this case, with SPI, we can also incorporate the role of temperature on water availability. So essentially, it is based on P minus ET, precipitation minus evapotranspiration. So for dry extremes, we looked at 4-month SPEI at the end of September. So that basically gives us a condition for the entire monsoon season, right? And so we looked at dry extremes SPEI for any given monsoon season is less than -1. And similarly, hot extremes during the monsoon were identified that mean temperature for the monsoon season, if the anomaly of that is more than 1 degree Celsius, right? And then we can go for the concurrent hot and dry monsoon when the condition SPEI is less than -1 and temperature is more than -1 in any given year. So we will look these things in observed climate. We will also look these hot, dry, and hot and dry, concurrent hot and dry conditions or monsoons in the future also. So the motivation was that how hot and dry extremes affect food grain production. So if you look at your left, this panel shows basically that how yields have changed in India, cereals, food grain, rice, and wheat. And what we can see that there has been tremendous increase in in crop yields or food grain production in India, which basically made India self-sufficient. So we are not importing food grain, despite we have roughly 1.35 billion people living here, right? So there has been tremendous progress, especially after 1970 because of green revolution. So improved seed, groundwater pumping, and irrigation expansion happened, and that led to. But interestingly, you can also see some sort of variability in this yield data, right? And that is mostly caused by climate. So you see the dips in yields, and these are the major drought events. So if you look here on your right, I saw precipitation anomaly at the top, then temperature anomaly, second panel, and then you have food grain anomalies, rice, wheat, and cereals. And if you find out the extremes, by the way, this is all observation based. So observed climate, whenever extreme drought and hot anomalies occurred, they also affected the food crop yields and food grain production in India. And we also estimated correlation, like how much, what is the correlation with monsoon season precipitation to food grain yields, like 0.7, and then monsoon season temperature -0.47. So that tells us that why it is important to have a normal monsoon for the food grain production in India. We then also looked at these extremes like SPEI. We again found out concurrent dry and hot extremes. So here dry extremes are based on SPEI. Once again, this is for the observed period 1951 to 2018. So now we know that what are the years that have had SPEI less than -1, and those were the severe droughts, right? And then temperature anomalies in the monsoon season. So what are the years when temperature anomalies went more than 1 degree Celsius in positive side? And we can find out these years for the concurrent hot and dry events or monsoon season. And we then look at that, what were the condition for Nino 3.4 anomaly that is during the monsoon season. And we found like majority of these events occurred during the El Nino, because of El Nino or El Nino, they were associated with the El Nino. And that, that tells us that these events are basically the variability or occurrence of these events in observed climate is associated with El Nino. So then we went further to look at individual these years and also the SST anomalies associated with it. So what here you see that all those major drought or dry and hot extremes, 51, 1972, up to 2015, right? And what was the SPI and temperature anomalies, and what was the SST anomalies associated with these events. And if you will, you will see or you will notice that most of these hot and dry extremes during the monsoon occurred during El Nino. So El Nino means you see positive red colored in the Central Pacific. That tells us El Nino. Sometimes the El Ninos are strong, sometimes they are weak, and they are in different regions. So there are multiple Nino index available, Nino 3, 4, 3.4, and 1 and 2 and 1.2. Right, so one thing, this observational based analysis so far, tells us that hot and dry extremes mostly occur during the El Nino, and they have a great impact on food production in India. Okay. So now, since we were interested to look at how these events are likely to occur or projected to occur in the future climate, so we used CSM lens simulations, 1920 to 2100, from 40 different ensemble members. Those are run with the different initial conditions. So we were interested to sort of know that whether CSM captures the coupled monsoon rainfall and SST variability that exist in observation. Okay, so in the top panel, these are the results from maximum covariance analysis, and that those tell us the coupled variability of SST and the monsoon season precipitation. So you see here JJS SPEI and also JJS sea surface temperature, and the colors tells us that whenever the sea surface temperature anomalies are positive in the Pacific, you see that across India there is a decline in the monsoon season precipitation, or there is a drought. So the top row is for the observations, right? And then bottom C and D panels are for the 40 ensemble. We did analysis for each ensemble members, and then then took the composite ensemble mean of all those, and then we see that lens also captures the variability associated with INSO and also IOD, which is Indian Ocean dipole that we see in the Indian Ocean, negative and positive anomalies in dipole sense. And that is extremely important because most of the climate models, CME5 models that we have analyzed, these features are not very well represented. Okay, so then we also looked at the seasonal cycle, how seasonal cycle is being captured. Seasonal cycle of rainfall or precipitation is captured in the CSM lens, and surprisingly, lens has a very good representation of monsoon distribution, also the seasonal cycle, monthly distribution of rainfall, and that gives us sort of more confidence to use this data set for further analysis. Once we did that, we looked at how precipitation, temperature, and potential evapotranspiration are projected to change in the future. So what you see here in panel A, B, and C, x-axis is year starting from 2000 going to 2100, and the reference period is 1971 to 2000. So this is 30-year moving mean. So anomalies, so we have removed the mean of 71 to 2000, and you see that precipitation is, monsoon season precipitation is projected to increase about, let's say 6% by the end of 21st century. Temperature is projected to increase by 4 degrees, these are from RCP 8.5, And potential evapotranspiration is also projected to increase about 9 to 10 degrees Celsius. So what we can get out of here is that, okay, monsoon rainfall is going to increase, so as the temperature, and that will increase the potential evapotranspiration. So you take the difference between P minus PET that is being used to estimate droughts during the monsoon season. So whether droughts will increase or decline, that will depend on the difference between precipitation and potential evapotranspiration. And then we estimated the for every 30-year period, we estimated the number of dry events. So how many times SPEI is less than -1, right? So this is the frequency. Y-axis is the frequency, x-axis is the year, and then E panel is hot events. How many times temperature anomalies during the monsoon exceeds 1 degree Celsius. So you see, by the end of 21st century, almost every year will be anomalously warm year, and then we know we have concurrent dry and hot extremes. So when SPEI is less than -1 and temperature anomaly is more than -1. So that so essentially we see that concurrent hot and dry extremes are increasing, and I think I have to wrap it up. How many minutes I have? Or
about 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. So then we looked at that what is happening in the distribution. So we plotted like kernel density functions for the reference period and the future 30-year period, and you see that SPEI, and we don't see much different or sharp increase in drought as we have seen in the previous figure, but the temperature is going to increase extremely, that is expected, and that will also change the PET, and that the combined response will be that extreme events, concurrent hot and dry extremes will increase, that we have seen. So then the question was that how these concurrent hot and dry extremes are contributed or associated by El Nino. So we looked at all the extremes, hot and dry, concurrent hot and dry extremes during the monsoon in our reference period in each ensemble of 40 members from CESM lens. So this is 1971 to 2000. By the way, this is composite. So we have SST anomaly associated with each hot and dry, concurrent hot and dry extremes. And then you take the mean. So we get this for the reference period. And for the 30-year end of 21st century, you see that again, very sharp response of El Nino associated with these kind of events. We also see that the anomalously warm SST in the Nino 3.4 region is also increasing in the future. And that has implications, right? Because El Ninos, the frequency of El Ninos are increasing, and that's why we are seeing that more and more hot and dry extremes. And the contribution of El Nino, like what we found in the reference period, was roughly about 30%. End of 21st century, it becomes roughly about 50% in all these events. So here are the conclusions, like what I have shown you, that these concurrent hot and dry extremes have a considerable impacts on food production or crop yields, and they are projected to increase in future. They are linked mostly in El Nino, in the observed climate, and also in the reference climate in CSM lens simulations. And in future, if they keep rising, of course, there is, we can expect more and more challenges to maintain the food production in India, and long-term warming can further enhance or influence INSO-modulated hot and dry extremes. We use single climate model, that is CSM, but we use many more ensemble members. But similar analysis can be performed using more GCMs that have a skill to simulate ENSO monsoon relationship. And that's all I have for today. Here are some references. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vimal. That was a very nice talk. And about a topic that is obviously important, but not that well studied, I would say. So good to know that you and your team are working on this important problem. We have about 10 minutes for questions as usual. Gabriele Missouri has a question, which he put in the chat and is short, but Gabriele, if you want to elaborate at all, please do so.
I was just, I was wondering about the plots you showed, Vimal, on the future projections, where you have the timeline in your slide.
All right, I can go to the slide. Yeah, this one?
Yes, number 13. And I was wondering, there is quite a large dip up to kind of 2045. There is kind of a below historical evapotranspiration, even though the monsoon is essentially on historical levels and the temperature is higher than the historical levels. So it seems there's as much rain as before, higher temperatures, but lower PET.
Yeah, that is quite a good question. And so what we expect that PET should increase, right?
Well, I guess that would be my naive guess, because I noticed that I guess the shading here is the standard deviation of the large downward.
Just to tell you, I will certainly look into that more. But PET here we estimated using many other variables. So this is Penman-Montier, not necessarily just temperature, right? So this also includes CO2 concentration. It also includes wind and other variables like vapor pressure deficit. So to be sure that what is happening during this period, why this is decline, we will have to sort of look into other variables, that what is happening in other variables. But that's a very good question, and I did not specifically pay the attention to this anomalous behavior between 2020 and 2040, that why there is a decline.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Georgia, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for the nice presentation, very interesting. I wanted to ask if you look also the interseasonal variability, or if all your plots are based on the seasonal averages, if I understood it correctly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, just
so
because.
Yeah, go ahead,
yes.
Please.
And just because it's, I think, very interesting that due to global warming, I mean, rainfall on average is going to increase and temperature is also going to increase. But here we are looking at hot and dry streams. So let's say, even though rainfall is increasing, we still will see more drier streams. So I was wondering, or let's say my guess would be that the interseasonal variability is changing in a way that even though the seasonal mean is for rainfall is higher, then we still may have longer breaks or more breaks. And even if we have like more active or stronger active phases, that is not really compensating the temperature, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, you are absolutely right. And not in this paper, but in a different work where we are looking at flash droughts. So we are looking at what is happening within the season, like using soil moisture and temperature and landfall simulations. So there is a very strong increase in seasonal variability. In terms of, if you look at the seasonal total rainfall during the monsoon season, in projections, that is going to increase. But if you look at like the number of flash droughts or number of dry and hot extremes on a weekly time scales, that is also increasing. And that is happening because the distribution of rainfall is not same across the season. You see a lot of rain in either early season or early monsoon season, or then prolonged dry period in the late monsoon season. So seasonal average is still higher than the your normal, but you will see the frequency of these extremes at a weekly time scale or daily time scale increases in the future climate. So yeah, your hypothesis or you are absolutely right in that sense.
Thanks.
Building, yeah, very interesting question. Building off of that a little bit, in the news when we read about heat waves in India, it usually seems to be in May or early June before the monsoon has hit. And I wonder if you or anyone else has looked at whether those types of really impactful heat waves can occur during a monsoon break or sort of after the main monsoon precipitation period.
Yeah, I mean, we have done quite a bit work on heat waves, and you are right. Heat waves occur in April and May in the observed climate. If you move to future climate, they are occurring like starting from March and coming to June if the monsoon onset is not at the right time, right? So that is right. But if you look at this interesting thing, whenever drought happens, you see like temperature anomalies going to more than like 1 or 2 degree. So this is not, you cannot call heat wave because the temperature in absolute sense may not go that high for a 4 or 5 days in comparison if you compare with the April, May summertime temperature. But this anomalously high temperature has implications for agriculture, number one, because it can quickly deplete your soil moisture. So this is like seasonal high temperature, seasonal anomaly. The other implication it has that if your monsoon break is prolonged along with the basically positive temperature anomalies, it can create very high humidity, and combination of high humidity and high temperature can lead to heat stress even during the monsoon season, or I can say at least early monsoon season, let's say June or mid of July. Until mid July temperature is not that lower. If it runs well in August, temperature goes low. So in June, we may have still temperature 38, 39, and even up to 40 degrees Celsius sometimes.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah. Okay, so Ravi Kumar put a comment more in the chat. I guess Sohil has another comment about. Sohil, I guess we have another minute or so. Do you want to elaborate on your comment there, or is it just a comment? I mean, is it a question or? Yeah. Vimal, do you see have you seen the chat?
Yeah. So I have seen.
Bit of an exchange there.
I need to take this Ravi Kumar's question, right? So
yeah,
the question is that
yeah.
that if future concurrent events are driven by temperature, absolutely right. But we should not forget that even if there are projections suggesting monsoon rainfall is going to increase, but that doesn't mean that droughts won't occur. So there will be still year-to-year variability, right? Not every year will become abnormally wet year. So and then you have anomalously high temperature because temperature projections are quite robust. So if you count concurrent hot and dry monsoon seasons, that number goes up. But the major contribution is coming from temperature. That is right, Ravi. And that we have seen in the slide somewhere, yeah, on this slide. So I would say that droughts are occurring in certain sort of year-to-year variability is controlling occurrence of droughts. But then since heat extremes are occurring more or more, becoming more frequent, so the combination of these two still goes higher what we are expecting in the reference point in terms of frequency. And
Yeah.
then there is another question, Sohel, regarding if PET depends on moisture too. I think at the start of graph, we have an increase in temperature, but there is not enough moisture in comparison to the rest of the graph having more precipitation. Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, in PET estimation, we don't use rainfall as a variable, right? So PET is controlled by other variables like vapor pressure deficit and wind and temperature and CO2 concentration. So I'll have to check that why and what variables are basically controlling this dip. I don't know right now, and but I will definitely check. But certainly it is not controlled by rainfall.
Taking apart components always a perennial task in climate science. All right,
Yeah.
so thanks very much, Vimal. And we will now move on to our second speaker, Daniela.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks again. That was really nice and detailed. All right, so now we'll move on to the second speaker, Daniela Domeisen. She is a professor at ETH Zurich, and her research interests span many facets of atmospheric dynamics, including teleconnections, stratospheric coupling, and the prediction of extreme events, especially in the Euro-Atlantic sector, and especially involving forecasting and predictability. So we're very happy to have her here today to talk about remote forcing of extreme events. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Colin. And thanks a lot for the invitation, Colin and Kai. So can you see my full screen now?
Yes.
Perfect, okay, great. So I'd like to talk about remote forcing of extreme events and how that links to compound events. And it's a bit of an overview talk, a bit of a perspective talk. So it includes contributions from a range of different people, some of them in my group listed here, and then also a lot of external collaborators. So I'd like to jump right in with the connection between remotely forced extremes and compound events. And basically, I've been using the diagram that from the Chaischl paper that came out this year and linked the remotely forced extremes with the compound events and saw if I could see any connections there. So remotely forced extremes can kind of take the shape of a lot of different compound events depending on what's involved. But they're probably most similar to preconditioned compound events because they involve this remote, persistent event. It can be either an anomaly or an extreme event, and that leads to an extreme event in another location. So oftentimes there is not just this remote event involved, but there's also local driver feedback that then amplifies the event or has some other influence there. But the remote event is often also involved in forcing that driver feedback or has some kind of relationship with that. That can then, of course, lead to different hazards and impacts depending on that kind of extreme event. So why am I very interested in these remote persistent events? It's mostly because I work on predictability and prediction, and these remotely forced extremes and hazards have very high potential for long-range prediction. By long range, I mean weeks to months to even years. So anything that we know happens remotely and has an influence on local extreme events can potentially be used for long-range prediction. So that's what makes them so interesting. Now, which places in the world could actually benefit from this knowledge about remote extremes? And this goes back to a figure I made a while ago, looking at seasonal predictability for boreal winter. This is December to February in the German seasonal prediction system. And so red means high prediction skill, wider blue means low prediction skill on seasonal time scale. So basically that's trying to forecast December, January, February from November. And some things you notice is the tropics, obviously, not so surprising, have high prediction skill, and the exotropics have low prediction skill. But you see some additional areas of interest that have extremely low prediction skill. So for example, there's this blue blob over Europe. Europe happens to be one of the most unpredictable places on timescales of weeks to months, which is one reason why it's actually a very interesting area. Although obviously there's been a lot of interest and a lot of research into predicting the weather over Europe. And then there's a couple of other interesting areas over North America and also over South America. And I'll go into part of these during the talk. So I'd like to focus on two examples specifically. In the first part, I'd like to look at winter colder outbreaks. I'm going to specifically look at remote forcing from the upper atmosphere. In the second part, I'm going to look at summer heat waves and remote forcing for these. So in the first part for winter colder outbreaks, we often, at least for the North Atlantic Europe sector, look up into the stratosphere. And the stratosphere exhibits these so-called sudden stratospheric warmings. They happen about every second year. And here's an illustration of one that happened in 2018. What you see is potential vorticity at about 30 kilometers height. So what you see is the pink area here is the polar vortex, meaning that we have large spinning vortex just in these or around this pink area. So we have a very strong vortex at the time. Now, as we're going into February, the vortex becomes even stronger, but then at the same time, as you can see here, it's ripped apart into two separate vortices that are then interacting with each other. Now, why are we interested in these events? They happen about every second year. Here you see the evolution again. The event happened on February 12th in this case. The interesting thing here is that although these events are not very predictable, they do have an impact in at the surface, in particular with respect to colder outbreaks, which is what I'm going to look at. And the nice thing is that once they happen, we actually get added predictability of weeks to months. So what is the actual surface impact that we see? Well, once one of these events happens, and this is now a composite of a lot of these events together that occurred. So this is here day 0 when the event occurred. And then after that event, we can see that there is a strong warming or higher tip tension height in the stratosphere. And that basically persists here for about 2 months. So basically in the lower stratosphere, we can see a very persistent event. And that's one of these extreme persistent remote events that I'm talking about. So every once in a while, we see this dripping down into the troposphere. And that's exactly when this increased probability of colder outbreaks occurs. So what does it look like when we see one of these drip downs to the surface? This is what the temperature looks like. So this is 3 to 4 weeks after one of these stratospheric events. And you can see that basically a 2-meter temperature gets much colder here, basically over all of Northern Europe, over Eurasia, also in the Arctic Oceans, but there's also hotspots of warmer temperatures here in Eastern Canada, also in the Middle East and parts of Asia and Northern Africa. So the interesting thing is now that we can actually, at least to a certain extent, predict that is going to happen. So if you look at 3 to 4 weeks after the event happens, we can more or less, here in the multi-model, we predict that exactly this pattern is going to happen. And 3 to 4 weeks is a significantly longer prediction time scale for colder outbreaks than we would usually have in any kind of setting. So you wouldn't really expect this usually. So if you put this back on our map, then we have persistent warm lower stratospheric temperature that can lead to colder outbreaks both over land and over the ocean, as you can see here. And this can then lead to different impacts. So over the ocean has been shown that this can actually lead to so-called polar lows, which are also called Arctic hurricanes. They can have devastating impacts on, for example, offshore infrastructure or Arctic shipping, especially now with climate change that this is increasing in the Arctic regions. And over land, of course, this leads to extreme cold temperatures over land that can then have human health impacts. Now, this is kind of like a straightforward pathway, but of course, it's not that simple. And as I said, there is often additional drivers or feedback that determine if a colder outbreak is actually going to happen. And this is the case both for over the ocean and over the land. And over the ocean in particular, the Arctic sea ice distribution has a big impact on where exactly and when these outbreaks happen. At the same time, the stratosphere is also responsible for changing that sea ice distribution. And for the land, there's an additional driver as well, and I'm going to just quickly go into that. Because there is a role for also what the troposphere is doing at the same time when the signal comes up from up above. So this is the figure that you saw before. So this is an average over all the events, and we can see there is a very persistent temperature anomaly in the lower stratosphere that eventually drips down. But then if you divide this up into what happens in the troposphere at the time when the event happens, around these days, then we can see that for some of the events that already have, for example, an atmospheric blocking over Greenland, then basically we don't get any of this downward dripping afterwards. So we don't really get these colder outbreaks that we would be expecting. And on the other hand, if we have European blocking around day 0, so a block over Europe instead, then we basically get a very strong projection onto these colder outbreaks. So basically, what we see here is that the local North Atlantic weather patterns also have an influence on when and where exactly these colder outbreaks occur. So it's not just the remote forcing, of course, but there's local feedbacks again and local drivers that can have an influence. And that will then determine, of course, what the hazards and impacts are. Now, this is just for colder outbreaks. The stratosphere has a range of different impacts onto the surface in terms of extremes. So we have a very long-lived anomaly in the stratosphere. This can lead to also to sea ice changes, as I said, to heat waves here, to flooding events, or dry spells here in Northern Europe. And also in the Southern Hemisphere, this can contribute to, for example, wildfires and droughts over Australia. We see changes in the jet stream in the Southern Hemisphere. So lots of different impacts that can come from the stratosphere. So as a summary of that first part, there can be persistent stratospheric anomalies and extremes that can then lead to surface extremes. And in particular, I talked about the colder outbreaks, both over the land and over the ocean. The nice thing about these is that they can potentially give us long-range predictability. Again, it depends also on the local drivers, but overall, this remote driver gives us some enhancement in the probabilistic probability. The combination of all of these local drivers and the remote drivers can then lead to different hazards and impacts, and these are the things that then make these compounding factors. So in the second part, I would like to talk about summer heat waves. And of course, you could also turn this around and talk about summer cold air outbreaks and winter heat waves. Usually they're just not as devastating in terms of the impacts that we see, but of course, similar mechanism might be in place there. But I'm going to talk about the extremes here. So basically, when it gets really hot in summer or really cold in winter. And for the summer heat waves, there have been lots of different remote factors that have been identified for potentially impacting when heat waves occur. So a range of different papers, and I'm not listing them all here, but just some examples show that sea surface temperatures over the North Pacific, for example, can have an influence on when heat waves occur over eastern United States and Canada. The Caribbean has an influence on heat waves over Europe, and also actually cold anomalies in the North Atlantic, such as the cold blob that we have, can have an influence on European heat waves. Now, there's a lot more of these connections, especially also for the Southern Hemisphere. So I'm just listing a couple of examples here. And if you put those back onto the diagram, then we think of remote anomalous SSTs that can then potentially lock in place certain atmospheric patterns that can then lead to a land heat wave. Land heat waves, of course, lead to extreme land temperatures and can have extreme impacts on human health, morbidity and mortality, and also ecosystem impacts. So one example I would like to look at is the 2018 heat wave. And this is an average for June to August, so it's a 3-month average, but you can still see the extreme temperature anomalies that we had. So several degrees even in a 3-month average is quite something. There was an extreme heat wave over North America, over Europe, and also over Siberia, as you can see here. And I'd like to pick one particular episode that was interesting. That was at the end of July and early August, which was a particularly hot episode. And what you see here is the actual temperature anomalies plus the jet stream anomalies that were present during that particular week. Now I'm just going to put this on top over as a schematic. So we have the warm anomalies here over Northern Europe, and then we had this cold Atlantic anomaly that was also had been suggested to potentially have an influence on heat waves in Europe. And what would usually happen in like a normal atmosphere is that this pattern would basically move on. Maybe not in that perfect shape, but that's just showing it as a schematic. But that didn't really happen during that year. So there is a lot of questions here. Did the anomalous surface temperatures upstream kind of block the jet stream in place? This also reminds of the kind of wave number 7 pattern that Kaikon, who had a paper about, several papers about, that happened just about a month earlier, and that was observed there. So, so basically the atmospheric circulation kept in place and kept that heat wave alive. So what was interesting for us in that regard was, the fact that it's remotely forced, or it's potentially remotely forced, does that mean it's more predictable? So we looked at that particular episode, and we picked from that particular summer a hot spell and cold spell. And what you see here is on the bottom axis is just the evolution during that particular summer. And on the vertical axis, you see the forecast lead time. So basically, the longer we stay at the same kind of magnitude here and the same sign, the more predictable it was. So what you see for the hot spell is that basically we have a predictability out to about 3 weeks over here. And for the cold spell, it goes to about 7 to 10 days. So what does this mean now? So basically we have two different events, two opposite events that have a different predictability. So is this a general pattern, or is this just one case in 2018 that worked that way? Ole Wolf did this work working on trying to find out what is actually better predicted. And I'm just showing the plot now for Western Europe. The pattern looks very similar for other regions in Europe. And what is shown here is the extreme independence index, meaning that anything that's on the top of the diagonal means that hot extremes are better predicted than the average temperatures. And everything to the bottom that's on the bottom of the diagonal means hot extremes are more difficult to predict than average temperatures. And you can see that basically everything is on top of the diagonal, meaning the hot extremes are always better predicted. I can tell you that this is not really the case for cold extremes. So the hot extremes are always better predicted for summer. Cold extremes are not really any better predicted than average temperatures. So, and I don't have a good answer to this yet, but potentially the increased predictability might be due to the remote world drivers that we have that can affect these heat waves. So if you go back to our diagram, then we can look at what could potentially be forcing this land heat wave. But in addition, again, we have to look at these local drivers and feedback. So atmospheric blocking has often been linked to heat waves. Actually, most of the heat waves are caused by blocking. But of course, the remote driver can also have an impact on when the atmospheric blocking occurs and where it does. And then at the same time, there's also feedbacks with the soil right underneath the heat wave, which can also amplify the heat wave. Now, we talked about land heat waves a lot, but at the same time, if you have atmospheric blocking, it doesn't just cause land heat waves, it also causes marine heat waves, in fact. Those haven't really been covered so much with respect to atmospheric blocking, but they have huge impacts in the ocean on ecosystems, for example. And these can actually come about as compound or concurrent events. I'm just showing two examples here. One that happened in 2003. A lot of people talked about the 2003 heat wave over land. Actually, it was also a marine heat wave in the Mediterranean that occurred at the same time. And at the same time, or a couple of years later in 2014, there was a compound land and marine heat wave in Southeast Brazil. And it went on in January, February 2014. So in summary, we can better predict heat waves that may then cold events in summer that may potentially be due to remote factors, but this we will still have to actually show that this is always the case. But we don't really fully understand yet the interplay between the remote factors and the local drivers. And this is made even more complicated by the fact that we have climate change, and all of these different systems, the ocean, the atmosphere, and the land will change. And obviously then that could also mean that the different components will also change how they interact with each other. Especially for heat waves, this is a big issue because they're projected to become more extreme. We need to understand why this is the case and if we can actually predict them. We know they're becoming more extreme, but we don't know when exactly they're going to happen. So that's one of the tasks that we've set for ourselves. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I can imagine that there are a lot of questions, so please feel free to either use the raise hand tool or post your question in the group chat. And while people let things sink in, I'll just have a question. I was wondering if that concept of atmospheric preconditioning that you showed for winter could also be applied potentially on summer, that specific jet positions, for instance, are more sensitive to SST forcings in some regions, for instance, and then are more likely to pick up specific forcings just because of, yeah, they have been in a specific state already.
You mean for the North Pacific for winter? If the
for summer and yeah, both Pacific and South Atlantic.
Yes, I mean obviously probably this needs to be looked at separately between the Atlantic and Pacific because the jet is very different. And I imagine that this can have an effect because basically it's been shown separately for the Pacific and for the Atlantic that it has an effect on heat waves. But then at the same time you can have these circumpolar modes as you did in your research. So yes, I definitely imagine this could have an effect. In terms of the coupling to the stratosphere, that's usually focused on the North Atlantic mostly. So most of the forcing for the stratosphere comes from the Pacific, but most of the response is already Atlantic. So there's less of a connection there. But definitely this will impact where the jet is going to be. Yeah.
Right.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, partly, I guess. I was more thinking about this type of analysis that you did, where you looked at certain regimes and how those affect the position of extremes then once such SSWs occur. Such a concept could be applied to summer as well, to some degree. I mean, of course, not as much linked to the polar vortex, but possibly to other preconditioning.
Basically, I mean, the weather patterns that we use there are basically they're available year-round, so they work year-round. So this could certainly be done for summer as well, and then looking at other remote predictors, then like tropical predictors, for example. Yes, that would be interesting. Yes, we haven't done it yet.
So anybody has a question? to this very interesting topic. This is your opportunity now. I see many familiar faces in the participants list. I'm sure they'd be really interested.
I have one question.
Yeah, Vimal, please go ahead.
Ask a question?
Yeah.
So, I mean, this marine heat waves is a really emerging topic. And I think many people are working nowadays to understand. So what sort of observations do we use if we want to estimate marine heat waves? So sea surface temperature or some other variables?
Yeah, I think for actually kind of quantifying it, you could just use SSTs. Of course, if you look at a lot of people are looking at ecosystem impacts, and you could, for example, look at also the chemistry that's going on, and like solved oxygen and so on. If you look at the influence on the atmosphere, then often heat fluxes are used for that in order to understand what the actual kind of upward influence is. So yeah, it really depends on your application of what you're looking at. And from my understanding, it's not yet fully understand how that interacts with the atmosphere. So it's clear that it forces the atmosphere, and it's also clear that atmospheric blocking can force sea surface temperature, but it's not really clear what that how that feedback works between the two. So I think that's another interesting question there.
Yeah, so I'm not sure whether you have done this. What I would expect, if you have marine heat waves, you will increase evaporation, right? If vapor pressure deficit is not that low, so there would be a lot of increase in evaporation also. So reanalysis data of this water budget can also tell over the oceans, can also tell about marine heat waves, right?
So again, what could tell about marine heat waves? The latent heat flux, you mean, or?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because
yeah.
Because sea surface temperature is just the top layer, right? It doesn't tell us anything about what is happening in deep ocean. But yes. I would expect that evaporation from the oceans could be better proxy, because it is based on the entire column thermal heat budget, and that could give us a better idea about the marine heat waves. I don't know. I have no idea. I'm just asking.
I mean, to be honest, I haven't seen much research on marine heat wave impacts on the atmosphere. There's been a lot of research on marine heat wave impacts on marine ecosystems, because that's a very clear and really has devastating impacts that are not really seen from the surface often. But in terms of impact on the atmosphere, I honestly think this is a very important topic, and I haven't seen so much on this. So I think there's going to be more in the future on this.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's a question by Marlene Kretschmer. You want to go ahead? I think you're muted.
Now? Okay,
yeah.
Perfect.
Now you're on.
Yeah, thanks, Daniela, for the talk. Really nice. Just out of personal interest, you seem to prefer the term remote forcing over like teleconnection. Is there a reason for this, or just coincidence? I don't know.
I do use teleconnections too. Actually, it might be a coincidence that I haven't really used it in this framework. I don't really use teleconnection for kind of vertical connections in the atmosphere. I use it more for tropical to extratropical teleconnection, because maybe that's for historical reasons. And I also don't use it so much for kind of circumglobal patterns, but honestly, that might just be a personal preference. I don't know what people's opinions on that are.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot. There's another question by Cassandra Rogers.
Thanks for an interesting talk. You said that over Europe there was that blocking where you'd normally expect the Rossby wave pattern to shift eastwards, and it just didn't happen in 2018. Have you noticed a similar thing in other locations, or is this sort of a one-off thing for that like really extreme event?
Well, I think it does tend to happen a lot in the same places. And what we're currently trying to figure out is what this depends on. So basically, is it just that the SSTs, I mean, basically, if you look at the North Atlantic, like there's a cold blob and probably it's, you know, and it's always in the same location. So basically you would have a tendency to always have the jet kind of stuck in the same location. The same thing is with topography, which obviously doesn't change. So heat waves tend to occur with respect to these kind of given features. But of course, this happens over other locations too, and it can obviously shift a little bit. But I think, especially with climate change, we might see more of these things where we have persistent, for example, SSTs, or we have persistent drying of the soil, for example, in some locations that might actually lead to heat waves happening over and over in the same location. This can obviously also apply to precipitation events and so on. I do think there is some kind of tendency towards this getting more frequent. And so, I mean, every heat wave is different, and we don't have kind of enough case studies. And so far, a lot of them have been looked at as case studies. It's very difficult to kind of put them all in one basket and say like, okay, we're going to treat them all the same because everyone is slightly different, has a slightly different forcing. But I do think we might, I mean, since we're now seeing more heat waves, unfortunately, we also get a lot more study subjects. So we might see a lot more research on this in the future. But yes, I do think they might occur in some of the same locations for reasons of persistent patterns that might occur more often.
Okay, thanks. And do you think that low over the Atlantic, do you think that was a reason for that pattern remaining so persistent?
I think that might in fact be linked to the cold blob, for example, in the Atlantic. I don't know why, I mean, it's hard to tell why particularly at that particular time it kind of managed to amplify or you know, actually interact with the atmosphere. But I do think that for the 2018 heat wave, there were a couple of periods when we certainly had some, you know, persistent surface forcing that actually interacted with the atmosphere. So that might have been one of these, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Are there any other questions? I don't see any raised hands so far. I see that there has been a lively discussion on the side on the PET values in the chat. Really interesting. So in case there are no further questions, I would close this webinar. Thanks a lot to the speakers. It was extremely interesting. Thanks for joining us, and also thanks a lot to all the participants. We were around 70 at one point, so that's a pretty good turnout. A recording of this will be online as usual on the RISC-CAN website, and we will have another webinar coming up in September, and we'll be sending an announcement via the mailing list as usual. So yeah, thanks again to everybody, and enjoy the evening or day or afternoon, wherever you are, and see you next time. Bye-bye.